And I guess I just want to start out by saying that I'm very proud to be a member of Workers' World Party. Why? Because we're a revolutionary organization, and we seek to overturn and overthrow the capitalist system here in the United States. And we seek to replace it with something much more humane, something where people have the right to jobs and health care and education, where people have a decent life and they don't have racist cops murdering people on the streets. And we realize that that revolution isn't going to fall down from the sky. You know, that's not how revolutions happen. That revolutions come about as a result of contradictions in the current society as they exist. And so, as Marxists, we're always paying attention to what's going on, and we view the world as a struggle between those who own the banks, the factories, the land, the natural resources, the oil wells, the big box stores, you know, the bourgeoisie or the 1%, as some of them called them, and those of us with nothing to sell but our labor, those of us who are the working class, or as some have come to call them, the 99%, though you can argue about specific percentages and mathematical equations. But that's what's going on. And so when we approach something like Occupy Wall Street, which wasn't largely a movement, most Occupy Wall Street people, most who were involved, would not tell you they're seeking to bring down the capitalist system. But we have to approach it as people analyzing and seeing the struggle between two classes and seeing how could a revolution come about and what duty do we have as a revolutionary party to try and intervene in such an event. And I think when people study the history of the United States centuries from now, they're going to say that the year of 2011 was a turning point in the class struggle in the United States. And it's not just Occupy Wall Street, but the whole year. Now, the year of 2011 began with the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, the Arab Spring. But then here in the United States, we saw, what did we see? We saw Wisconsin, the uprising in Wisconsin, where thousands and thousands of workers poured into the Capitol building to oppose a bill that would strip the rights away from union workers. And it was a huge uprising, and the whole country had Wisconsin on their lips. And then what happened here in New York City, there was something called Bloombergville. And some members of our party, Larry Hales and others, were very key in leading the Bloombergville uprising. I believe Sarah Flounders was even arrested at the very end of it when they seized the bank lobby. And it was, you know, young people. Tony Murphy was absolutely involved. People were there. They took over a corner of the street, and they said, we're not going to allow Bloomberg's budget, which cuts schools, which cuts fire departments, which cuts libraries. We're not going to allow that to pass, and we're going to be out and we're going to protest and we're going to demand that something be done about it. And they took over a street corner. It was far, far smaller than Occupy Wall Street, but it was a thing. It was there, and it was the party was very involved in that, in coalition with some social democratic groups as well as some anarchists. And it ended, and it was a triumphant thing. So then, after Bloombergville ended, you had Troy Davis, an African-American man who was executed for a crime that even some of the most extreme right-wing racist Republicans admitted he didn't commit. And the whole world knew that Troy Davis was innocent. And yet he was executed. And as Troy Davis was being executed, Occupy Wall Street, the occupation had already begun. It was maybe 2 or 3 days into the occupation of Wall Street that Troy Davis's life was taken out. And there was a march. There was a march against the execution of Troy Davis that our party was very key in building and bringing the Occupy forces into. And that march was from Zuccotti Park all the way down to Union Square, and it was quite amazing. So, Occupy Wall Street, some of us went to some of the early General Assemblies that were called in the park. I know the call went out from Adbusters, which is a kind of a liberal magazine that, you know, that talks about a lot of things. There'd been a call for some kind of occupation of Wall Street. And there were some early General Assemblies in the park, in Tompkins Square Park, and there was some discussion and some conversations, and we were there, and we didn't quite know what it was. It was very unfamiliar to us as people that are definitely socialists and communists, that are definitely involved in the revolutionary left. It was somewhat unfamiliar, the forces that were there. You know, some of the Ron Paul forces were there, and it was somewhat unfamiliar. But we met at our office, and we decided that when September 17th happened, there was so much buzz in the media leading up to it, that as revolutionaries, no matter what was going to happen, we had to be there because it was really substantial, and that what was going to happen was going to be important. We didn't know exactly what we were going to see, but we met at our office. We got some signs. We got a big sign that said, "A job is a right. Capitalism doesn't work." Workers' World Party, and we went down on September 17th, and we came out of the subway, and if people are familiar with the Wall Street area, they'll know that that escalator down at Bowling Green Plaza, right? It's a long escalator. It's really long, right? We were on that escalator, and I remember we were just wondering what's going to be up at the top when we get there. What's going to be there? We got up there and we saw a crowd of 400 or 500, mainly youth. Not all of them from New York, some from places like Oberlin, Ohio, some from places in Florida and Miami, who were there, and their signs were mostly progressive. They said things like corporations are not people, where's our bailout, kind of progressive things. And so we were quite excited, and I think it's safe to say we involved ourselves in Occupy Wall Street since then. And Occupy Wall Street certainly had an impact on millions of people around the United States and really around the world. We are the 99%. There's a group of super, super rich people, bosses and bankers. They've got this wealth and this power, and we're not one of them. We're not part of it. We're the other 99%. That was a progressive message. It may not be a directly Marxist message, but it was progressive, and it was a development. And I do recall, they held the park, and there was one day that was particularly meaningful for a lot of people, and that was the day that Bloomberg announced he was going to clear the park, and then the AFL-CIO and all kinds of progressive organizations sent an email out to their entire list. And by 6 a.m. that morning, there were something like 20,000 people on a work day in the morning piled into Zuccotti Park, making clear they were not going to let the police come and clear the park. And it was quite exciting and unprecedented, and it was quite, you could feel an energy there, and it really kind of pointed to, Occupy, it points to the fact that there are millions and millions of young people right now who don't have jobs, from all sectors of society, don't have jobs, don't have a place to fit in capitalism. You walk around, most people most of the time have peace with capitalism. They may not like this war, or they may not like that, but they walk through the world and they're mostly at peace with the capitalist system. But there were and there are still millions of young people who don't have jobs, don't have a future they can look forward to, don't have any hope about the future. So as a result, they don't have peace with capitalism, and they're actively looking to not just for an alternative, but something to fight about. They're looking to fight against the capitalist system. And Occupy Wall Street kind of made that clear, and it was a place that a lot of them really felt they could go. And I remember it was particularly frustrating to be in the park because there were so many people that were, libertarians that would say things like, "Oh, the U.S. just isn't true capitalism enough." But I do remember one day, and that was the day that it was announced that Gaddafi had been killed. That Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, had been murdered. And I was in the park that day, and I remember talking to some of these elements that wouldn't see eye to eye with us politically. But I remember talking to them, and they said, you know why Gaddafi was killed? Because he was going to set up an independent African banking system. Right? So even though their ideology was totally wrong, even though they're people we would never march with, somehow they identified with Gaddafi and not with the U.S. And that showed a level that things are changing. There's something going on there when there's a huge crowd of people in New York City who side with Gaddafi, who's just been killed by their government, and they side with Gaddafi against the U.S. government. That's kind of exciting, and it showed that something was happening. Now, probably the biggest intervention our party had into the Occupy movement was something called Occupy for Jobs, which happened in January. And it was an event that we tried to build, and it was an attempt to kind of give the Occupy forces and all the people that were pushed into motion by Occupy Wall Street a demand to fight for. The party, we've often raised a job is a right, fight, 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 and things like that. And so we had this event, and it was actually to coincide with the Martin Luther King holiday that it was held. And it was in Union Square, and, the party, we pasted up all over the city. There was all kinds of calls to build Occupy for Jobs, and a demonstration happened, and it was a good, 400, 500, 600 people who turned out. Most of them people we'd never seen before and never met. But they saw a sign that said Occupy, and everyone knew what Occupy was. And then for jobs, fight, and they wanted to fight for jobs. And it was an exciting demonstration, and a few of us were arrested. Not all of us in the planned arrest that happened, mind you, at the bank. Some of us intended to get arrested at the bank, but some others of us got arrested in mic checks, and it was pretty chaotic. And that is also one contribution that Occupy Wall Street made, because, it can get kind of frustrating. You go to so many protests where, everyone's got a sign that's been printed, and we're all marching around in a perfect circle, and everyone's got a permit and a sound permit, and we're going to march around in a circle, but tell you that's not what an Occupy Wall Street demonstration is like. I can promise you that. I remember the day the National Defense Authorization Act, the law that strips away habeas corpus, takes away people's rights, the day that was passed into law, a crowd of Occupy Wall Street people charged into Grand Central Station, right? Grand Central Station, and they charged in with their Occupy signs, screaming and yelling, and it was chaos, and it was beautiful, and it was the rage of a generation. And these things happen. I know that a similar demonstration took place at a mall, the mall that was owned by Brookfield Properties, which is who actually owns Zuccotti Park. They also charged in there, and it was chaotic, and they disrupted, and it was full of energy, and it was kind of a will to break out. And this thing that they do, this mic check, right? You know, this whole like mic check, you know, I am really, you know, that kind of thing, right? Well, that caught on, and I think people discovered that you can do that anywhere. If there's a corporation that's about to do fracking and pollute the environment, you can just walk into their office here in New York City with a crowd of your friends and shout, "Mic check!" Right? If there's a company that's promoting and it's promoting war around the world, you can walk out into their headquarters with a crowd of your activist friends, and you can shout, "Mic check!" You can do it, and it was MTA hearing, right? And that was another thing, right? I mean, we intervened in the MTA struggle as crazy things were going on, and it was pretty exciting. And I can remember, the other thing I remember about being in the park, especially when the occupation was going on, before it was brutally cleared by the NYPD, is how open people were to having conversations about communism and socialism. It was kind of amazing. I remember being at literature tables with comrades, and people would come up and just straight up ask us questions. People wanted to know what was going on. I mean, we sold the Workers' World newspaper like hotcakes in Zuccotti Park. 200, 300 papers just flying out, people taking up information, wanting to know, you know, what we had to say and why things were the way they were. And, you know, there was one problem I think a lot of people talked about. A lot of the Occupy forces, especially at the beginning, were saying things like, well, the police are our friends, or the police are part of the 99%. That didn't last so long, though. Especially when the police started clubbing them over the head and macing them in the face and kicking them. And one of the great developments that I think came out of the Occupy Wall Street thing is the fact that there were a number of Occupy youth who just came down for the Occupy thing who got involved in the struggle against stop and frisk. Right? Stop and frisk is now the big issue in the election right now. That's the burning issue. All the candidates are being asked, what's your position on stop and frisk? Well, a lot of young people who wouldn't have been active before went to Occupy Wall Street, met activists organizing around stop and frisk, and are now involved in a very important anti-racist struggle to end stop and frisk. So many things happened, and also, you know, the spring after Occupy Wall Street of 2012, that was the spring that Trayvon Martin was brutally killed by George Zimmerman. And the rallies that were called, the famous Million Hoodie March, you know, they had it in Union Square here in New York, and that was, at that point, that was a site that had been picked out by the Occupy movement that they were occupying. And there were Occupy people standing shoulder to shoulder with every force that was out to protest the killing of Trayvon Martin, and, you know, employing the tactics used by Occupy, taking the streets, marching and demonstrating. And it was extremely exciting, and you know, things were happening. And Occupy Wall Street was really a sign of the way the class forces are organizing right now. It's a sign of the fact that capitalism is at a point where it can't provide jobs to millions and millions of people. Capitalism is at a point where it's in a rut. It's at a dead end, as Fred has put it. And that's where we're at. And people can only hold on to their right-wing, their patriotic beliefs for so long. Pretty soon they're going to want to do something about it. Pretty soon they're going to want to do something about it. And Occupy Wall Street was the beginning of people doing something about it. So I guess the question is, you know, where do we go from here? What do we do? Well, I can tell you this, that there are millions of young people who were put into action by Occupy Wall Street. They'd never considered going to a demonstration, never considered protesting anything before, and now they're put into motion. And I think this is a very exciting time to be protesting and demonstrating and doing what we do, and trying to turn the uprising, the Occupy Wall Street uprising, the uprisings against stop and frisk, the uprisings going on all over the city, to try and transform them into revolutionary struggles that can actually overturn this system, because that's what we're thinking about. And we're constantly maneuvering and trying to figure out how we can move toward a socialist revolution in this country so we don't have to protest all the time. So, all right. Thanks, comrades.